Caution! The AJ and Quill show contains D&D content and is intended for a D&D audience. And, besides that, they're really weird. Hi everyone, welcome to Total Party Quill, your stop for monster tactics in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I'm Professor AJ, your friendly neighborhood tiefling, and with me as always is my fearless companion, Quill the Dragon. Say hi, Quill.
Greetings, puny humans. Prepare to absorb the knowledge Quill will dispense with his mighty jaws. So, what are we covering today?
Well, we got an awesome show for you today. A while back on Twitter, we posted up what kind of monsters and creatures you'd like us to cover in our lore and tactics videos, and our good friend Lauren suggested the Flail Snail. And what a pick that was, because these things are so cool.
Thanks, Lauren. And tell our Kira, I say, how you doing?
Okay, anyway, let's not waste any more time. You got questions, we got answers. Let's get dangerous.
So, what does Volo's Guide to Monsters actually say about this creature?
Now, the Flail Snail is a creature of elemental earth that is prized for its multi-hued shell. Hunters might be lulled into a false sense of confidence upon sighting this ponderous, seemingly non-hostile creature. If any other creature large enough to be a threat approaches too close, the snail unleashes a flash of scintillating light and then it attacks with its mace-like tentacles. Now, that's really all the lore that we get on this thing. The whole rest of the article is basically covering just the kind of treasure you can get off of killing one of these things.
However, it does tell you what the creature eats.
Right here it says, left undisturbed, the flail snail moves slowly across the ground, consuming everything on the surface, including rocks, sand, and soil, stopping to relish crystal growths and other large mineral deposits. It leaves behind a shimmering trail that quickly solidifies into a thin layer of nearly transparent substance inedible to the snail. This glassy residue can be harvested and cut to form window panes of varying clarings.
It can also be heated and spun into glass objects of other sorts. Some humanoids make a living trailing flail snails to collect this glass.
Now here it gives even more detail about what you can use the creature's shell for. It says here the flail snail's shell, which weighs 250 pounds, can sell for as much as 5,000 gold pieces. The shields made of this can be used to make spellguard shields, and for the first month after they've been harvested, they retain the anti-magic properties that the snail has. The shell can also be used to make robes of scintillating colors, if ground up and added to the dye when the garment is being fashioned. Now, super cool, though there's not very much lore there, so let's see what the stat sheet actually says. Now, the flail snail is a large, unaligned elemental creature. It has an AC of 16, 52 hit points, and a speed of 10.
Now, that's extremely slow, as you would expect from a snail.
Now, the flail snail has a high con and strength, which is typical for what you would expect from a brute or a tank creature. Although it's not very smart with an intelligence of 3.
It's basically as smart as a beast.
Now, interestingly enough, it's immune to fire, poison, and the poison condition, though it doesn't actually explain why. For senses, it has 60 feet of dark vision and tremor sense, even though you don't actually see any eyes or anything on the snail anywhere. It has the anti-magic shell property, which can reflect or absorb spells that have been cast at the creature. Its flail tentacles are really cool, it has 5 of them, and it uses them to attack. Anytime the flail snail takes 10 points of damage inside a single turn, one of its tentacles dies. They can regenerate so long as it has at least one tentacle left. If you manage to kill all 5 of its tentacles, the snail will then fully retract into its shell and it starts wailing. And it says in Volos here that it's a sound that can be heard up to 600 feet away, stopping only when the creature dies minutes later. For its actions, they're pretty basic. It can bash you with its flails as a multi-attack. It can use its shell to blind or even stun you. And it can withdraw into its shell to increase its defense. Now, note that's withdraw, not retract. There's a subtle difference there, but it comes up later. Now, with its flails, whenever the creature takes 10 damage or more in a single turn...
Now that's turn, not round.
Right, and that's very important. Anyway, if it takes more than 10 damage in a single turn, one of its tentacles dies. Now, the flail snail on average has about 52 hit points, so if you manage to kill all of its tentacles, it's basically dead anyway.
It would only have 2 hit points left.
Right, but with all of its tentacles gone, then this creature dies. It's just an interesting note because this is one of the only creatures that you can actually kill without reducing it to 0 hit points.
Now that's all really interesting, but what isn't the book telling you?
Now, the first thing to take note of is that there's a couple of things that are in the stat block that the flavor text doesn't really explain.
For example, its resistances.
Right, the flail snail is immune to both fire and poison and the poison condition.
Now the reason they're immune to fire in the lore is because they were able to produce huge amounts of mucus to cover themselves.
Now this mucus was intended to help with locomotion and to insulate the snail from drying out.
Drying out is a big deal to a flail snail.
This mucus is just so good that it effectively renders this flail snail immune to fire damage. Now the mucus is produced in a gland here at the front of the snail on its foot.
Basically where you would expect its chest to be.
Now, like a real snail, this mucus should actually be able to allow a flail snail to be able to climb walls similar to a spider climb ability. But that's not depicted in the stat block, although if you wanted to, you could totally include it.
The mucus from a flail snail was actually one of the ingredients you could use in a potion of climbing.
Although in the lore they said that was done really rarely because it tended to thicken the potion up and made it taste disgusting.
As you would expect.
Now the lore also states that the flail snail was immune to poison and the poison condition because its metabolism was so slow. In fact, it was so slow that any poison would naturally be negated by the antitoxins inside its own system before they even had a chance to get anywhere and do any damage.
Now for its senses, the flail snail has both dark vision and tremor sense. But when you look at the artwork, you don't see any eyes.
Now that's because the snail actually has these things here. These are its sensory organs, but they're not eyes. Now these sensory tentacles can do one of 3 things. Number 1, they can detect light and dark.
This is where its dark vision comes from.
Now this ability isn't specifically sight. It's used to tell the difference between above ground and below ground for the snail.
This is why, on top of being resistant to most magic, they are also immune to any kind of visually based illusion.
Now, the second thing that these sensory tentacles can do is they can detect vibrations in the air currents and in the ground.
This is where its tremor sense comes from.
Now, something to realize is that this is functionally different than, say, sonar or echolocation. That's why it's tremor sense and not blind sight like on a bat or a dolphin.
And the third thing these tentacles can do is help direct food into the snail's mouth.
Now, yes, these things do have a mouth. They're right here. It's an opening in the middle of the sensory tentacles. Now, the mouth contains a long tongue called a radula, which has sharp teeth all over the tongue itself. Now, these tongue teeth are strong enough to allow the flail snail to be able to eat stone and crystals, even diamonds.
Now, flail snails are completely nocturnal.
Right, they like the dark because being in the sun too long tends to dry them out.
And they don't like that.
This is the reason they have the ability to be able to tell between light and dark. Now, flail snails are incredibly passive and peaceful creatures. If they detect movement or light from any source, they'll just start moving in the opposite direction to get away from it. Because they eat rocks, they don't really need to attack other creatures for sustenance. So there's no reason for them to be near any creature at all. They prefer to be left alone.
Unless, of course, it's another flail snail and they wish to mate.
Now, because they're so passive, a flail snail will only attack you if you bother it first. And even then, if you attack it and then run away, it's not going to pursue you.
A flail snail will never chase you down.
Now, if we look at the shell, it's interesting all in its own rights. From Dragon 258, in an article called The Ecology of the Flail Snail, it was described as being so garish in color that even Jaraxel would say, that's too much.
The article describes the shell as looking like a few drunken leprechauns were set loose inside a paint shop.
And the article details a study done by a wizard named Gallengrave that he performed on the flail snails. You see, he wanted to study the magical properties of the shell.
The experiments involved a wand of magic missiles and a brooch of shielding.
And from Gallengrave's recorded notes, he determined that there was only a 1 in 3 chance of actually being able to affect a flail snail with any kind of a spell. Now, the numbers given to us regarding the likelihood of actually being able to affect a flail snail with any kind of magic are in fact a real in-game thing. There's lore backing all of this up.
It's not meant to just be a numerical number for a game mechanic.
Now, the shell is magical, but nobody knows why.
They only know that the snail must give part of its power to the shell, as evidenced by the shell slowly losing its magical properties after the snail dies.
Now, a newly hatched flail snail is only about 10 inches tall. Now, it's born with its shell, and its shell grows with it as the snail grows. They reach adulthood at about 4 years old, becoming about 8 feet tall, hence the large size, and they don't live much longer than 20 years.
Now you can make magic items from the shells.
Now, a skilled armorer using only the choice pieces of shell can fashion up to 3 shields from a single adult flail snail.
Theoretically, you could fashion breastplate or plate mail armor from the shell, but you would need a lot of it.
Now, the text says here that the shell weighs 250 pounds and can be worth up to 5,000 gold pieces. It can be used to make a spell guard shield or a robe of scintillating colors. But any shield made from the shell has the anti-magic property of the snail for 1 month after it's constructed.
In the lore, even after these shields lost their anti-magic property, they were still considered +2 shields.
Now, this is what's written in Voles, but these aren't the only things you can make from the shell. If you take the shell, you can brew it into potions of rainbow hues. You can take the stomach and liver of the flail snail and mix it with its blood to make elixirs of health.
And its skin can be finely ground and combined with its mucus to make potions of fire resistance.
And lastly, being hermaphroditic, the flail snails make something called a love dart. Now, real snails do the same thing, and it's crazy, but the point is, you can take these love darts, and you can use them to make filters of love.
So much loot. No wonder they were called slithering treasure chests.
Now, the flail snail's flail tentacles are actually really cool all by themselves. For one, they can regenerate them just like a troll would. Now, the flails themselves weigh about 10 pounds when the snail is fully grown, and they're made of hardened flesh covered in knobby protrusions, similar to osteoderms.
Now, it's important to note that these clubs are not spiked. They're blunted.
Hence the flails doing bludgeoning damage, not piercing damage. Now, in the lore, this was because the flail actually does have the ability to withdraw its whole self inside of its shell,
including its flails.
But when it does that, if it had spiky protrusions on every one of its flails, then there was a chance that it could injure itself, so these things were all blunted, not pointy. Now, these flails are interesting because they seem to be the only part of a flail snail's body that it's okay putting in danger.
In the lore, if you ever hit the actual body of a flail snail, it would kill it instantly.
Right, so when they were attacked, they would tuck their whole body up inside their shell and only leave their flails out.
Now, this insta-kill no longer works in 5th edition, but the behavior is still there.
Now, the flails regenerate like a troll's body does if they have at least 1 flail remaining. But something interesting happens if you cut off all the flails. Volos describes it as a snail beginning to wail, a sound that can be heard 600 feet away, and it doesn't stop until the snail eventually dies 5d6 minutes later. Now, wailing actually has 2 definitions. 1, a long, high-pitched sound, and 2, crying out in pain, grief, or anger. Now, most people actually assume that it's the first thing that they're referring to, a long, high-pitched sound.
And in the lore, this wail was actually able to draw in wandering monsters.
So kind of like the flail snail sticking it to you one last time as you kill it by calling all these monster creatures to attack whatever killed it.
But it's actually the second meaning, and it's really quite sad.
Now, the 1st edition Fiend Folio describes it as a pitiful wailing that has a 50% chance to attract wandering monsters. And when you look at the ecology of the flail snail, it describes it as the most pitiful cries imaginable, and it has a 50% chance to attract wandering monsters. It's said that these death wails are the only time that the snail ever vocalizes. Otherwise, it remains completely silent its entire life. Now, the reason why this is so sad is because what you have here is an enchantingly beautiful creature. a creature that is so passive that it won't attack you, and even if you manage to attack it, it won't pursue you. It just wants to be left alone. It eats stone and sand and crystals, and it doesn't hunt or prey on other creatures. It's completely nice, happy, and passive, living about its humble existence. If you come near one of them, it'll just leave and head the other way. Right here in Volos, it even says that when left undisturbed, the snail will stop to relish crystal growths and other large mineral deposits. So these creatures aren't just mindlessly existing, they actually are stopping to enjoy the good things in life. They'll relish a delicious meal of crystals, and they'll marvel at the natural beauty that the world has to offer. So when you hunt and you kill this creature,
Probably just because you're being greedy and want to sell off its shell.
when you kill it, you're going to be met with the saddest, most pitiful of cries, as the creature retracts into its shell, knowing it will never, ever again be able to experience the beauty and wonder of this world, as it cries itself to death.
You monster!
Now, keep in mind that everything we've said in this lore could be retconned for 5th edition.
They're classified as earth elementals now, so their tremor sense and immunity to poison and fire could simply be due to their elemental nature.
Right, same as the breeding, the love darts, all of it. It might not be a thing anymore, but this is what the lore says. Super cool, really interesting, but let's put it all together. How do these things behave in combat? Now, of the many strange and absurd creatures that they included in the original AD&D Fiend Folio, perhaps none of them are more often mocked and ridiculed than the poor and humble Flail Snail. Now, I like these things. They kind of have that whimsical, wizard-did-it approach to how they made creatures in the original Dungeons & Dragons.
But perhaps the Flail Snail actually has some historical legitimacy.
Right. Many medieval illuminated texts often included pictures of knights fighting snails drawn in their margins.
Pretty cool.
Now, when you look at the stats, this thing reads as a tank. It uses con for defense and it attacks with its strength, and it has lots of it.
The low intelligence also indicates brute tactics. But let's not kid ourselves. This thing isn't a predator. It's prey.
Right, they eat rocks, sand, and crystals they just find lying on the ground. These things do not hunt other creatures.
So unless it's another flail snail that wants to mate, flail snails will avoid every other creature, wanting to be left entirely alone.
Now, for the flail snails, while they're brilliant visually, they're not so brilliant when it comes to intelligence. With an intelligence of 3, they're not going to be employing any advanced combat tactics. Their combat's going to be very simple, very straightforward. Now, on the first round of combat, whenever a flail snail senses a creature of size small or larger coming within 60 feet of it,
That's the range of its dark vision and tremor sense.
right, whenever it senses a creature, the first thing it's going to do is use its shell defense. Now, there's a very important note that you have to realize here. When you read shell defense, you'll notice that there is nothing in here that would prevent a flail snail from either moving, attacking, or taking actions. It's kind of like a Spartan warrior holding up its shield so it can attack from behind the shield line.
Now the snail can deactivate this as a bonus action.
Right, but it's never ever going to do that in combat. For as long as the snail can actually sense a creature within its range, it's going to stay inside its shell. Now that can be a bit misleading when you read its stat block, because what it actually means is that functionally, this creature has an AC of 20.
Which makes sense. Slow creatures use armor class to protect themselves.
Now, after the flail snail uses its action to use shell defense, it's then going to use all of its movement to move away from whatever creature it detected. Now, on the second round of combat, if the flail snail can still detect a creature within its 60-foot dark vision or tremor sense range, it's going to use its action to use its scintillating shell ability.
Now this is a once per encounter ability.
And then it's going to use its movement to get as far away from that creature as possible. Now, on the third round of combat, if any creature is within 10 feet of the flail snail, it is now going to use its multi-attack to attack that creature with all of its attacks. Now, if multiple creatures are within range of its flails, it's just going to attack who's ever closest.
If a creature has actually hit the flail snail, it will attack them.
Now, an important note to consider, if any of the creatures within that range are still stunned from its scintillating shell ability, the Flail Snail will attack that stunned creature first.
Otherwise, it's just going to hit whoever's closest to it.
And after it's used its multi-attack, the Flail Snail will then use all of its movement to continue trying to get away from these creatures. Now, if the Flail Snail starts this turn and there are no creatures within the range of its flails, it's instead going to use the dash action to move as far away from the creatures as it possibly can. And that's it. Rinse and repeat these last tactics. It's going to continue using its multi-attack to attack any creature that's near it at the start of its turn, and then it's going to use its movement to get away from those creatures.
The snail will continue running away and multi-attacking anyone within its range until either the snail gets away, the creature dies, or the snail dies.
Now, these are really simple creatures, and they're super fun to put in your game.
They're kind of like really big cows.
Right, but they're cows that you can sell for like $5,000 and make magical shields out of.
And they're so pretty.
I know, I want one as a familiar. Now, hopefully this helps you put Flail Snails into your game. They're fun, they're interesting creatures, and you'll have a lot of fun with them inside your campaign.
And your players will have to make the moral choice of whether or not they kill the creature.
Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you had a good time. We'll see you next time. Get vaccinated, try to love each other, and... Is it time for school yet?
Bye!